This is, real quickly, I love this photo. This is from Purse Club in England. This is the Fens, an old creek that was drained, I guess, many years, well, the peatland was drained, and it left this creek with silt-filled channel. And that kind of harkens very directly to this notion of the ghost of land use past. This guy Harding wrote about Appalachian streams and he used that term in that, the ghost of land use past. So we're going to talk about legacy effects a lot. And legacy effects are the effects of earlier land use on the biophysical conditions we now encounter in the environment. Just quick acknowledgments. Some of the images here were taken off the web. They're often acknowledged, but most of them are non-proprietary, and I haven't really used any proprietary images to speak of. So the main objectives are to describe the magnitude, the immense magnitude of the landscape and ecosystem change that's happened over the years that we've lived here, particularly focusing on the Northeast and Pennsylvania. And then number two, to describe what I think are some appropriate approaches to environmental conservation in this highly altered landscape. And this, I hope I can get to the question and answer thing, because I'd like to have a little discussion about this. You'll have to keep nudging me. This is Potter County. I happened to find this on Google just by chance. There is a little bit area of Pennsylvania that appears to be unroaded, and that's what it would look like in 1492, except the trees would have been a lot bigger. The landscape, again, before settlement, was just forest covered pretty much entirely. Old chestnut trees, large old growth trees all over the place. This is actually from Olympic National Park. I've been up this as a kid. This is the Hoh River. This is about the last big alluvial river in the United States that comes out of an entirely intact watershed. You can see that it's anastomosing, or doesn't have a single thread channel. A lot of people now believe that a lot of the channels out here in the east were originally like this, though in this case, because this is glacial fed, in this case, in the eastern United States, these would have been islands of basically meadow. So that gives you maybe an analogy of what many of the streams, low gradient streams, might have looked like. But a lot of streams were undoubtedly dammed by beaver activity, and were completely altered in that way. Nothing resembling like that now really happens much in this area, and we tend to try to remove it when it does. This was pretty much a keystone species. The other thing that I harp on a lot, since I do a lot of work with streams, is that pristine forest streams are, when you find the pristine ones, and this isn't one, this is regrowing, but it's been regrowing for about 80 years, they're loaded with big wood, okay? You don't see that in Pennsylvania. You don't see that hardly anywhere anymore, and those streams are not pristine. Now this is a healthy brook, what's called a healthy or high quality brook trout stream in Pennsylvania, but it doesn't have any large wood in it. So, you know, I hate to be adamant about this, but I will be. Don't use the word pristine. It's not even close. It doesn't have a huge and essential component to what a healthy temperate forest stream would have. So in the 1600s or so, we had a landscape that was covered with forest, and it was the pre-industrial technology that was prevented much change. Doug can correct me if anything's wrong here with this. He's the historian, really. And a very low pre-settlement population. And then by 1600 in particular, in that thereabouts, there had already been this population collapse with the spread of smallpox and other European diseases throughout the Native American population. So they were, many people estimate, as much as 90% reduced from their former levels. So what we encounter in this landscape is not a virgin landscape, as many people described it, but a widowed landscape. Post-settlement land use. This is where Doug's going to give it a little bit more historical depth.
Okay, human use of the environment, of course, has gone on for over 10,000 years. This is a good example. This is Fairmount in Philadelphia. This is the Schuylkill River, and this is the old waterworks there. The art museum sits on top of this now. So that gives you an idea of where you are. But it was a platform mound prior to that, and to make a platform mound of this size is a fairly large undertaking. But one of the things that gave it away here, this is an aerial view from, that watercolor was from 1848. This is an aerial view in 1911. They quit pumping in 1909, but you can see how flat it is up there, and they just made the ponds because it was already flat. When they started building the art museum, 1916, they discovered that indeed the whole top part of of Fairmount was manufactured. It had been constructed as a platform mound, and shortly after about 1100 AD, and it was only used for maybe 50, maybe 75 years, and then abandoned. Probably along with the maize, bean, squash complex, agricultural complex, also came some sort of cult, a religious cult that swept across the Midwest and Northeast. It lasted a short time, but you can see this was a fairly substantial structure, even for people with stone tools and wood tools and fire. When you get to European settlement, then you suddenly get to much bigger, because the technology and the numbers of people are much more extensive. The most common settlement movements happened around mills, and there's mills all over the place. In some areas, the mills, the tail race, where the water came off the bottom of the water wheel, simply fell into the next pond along the creek. In other words, they were dammed as closely as they could possibly get them. KRIEDER mill is in Annville. Annville is in Lebanon County. This is part of the Susquehanna drainage, but I had just done some work over here, so I had all the pictures handy. But KRIEDER mill, 1797. The guy who owns it now makes race cars inside, so it's still in use, sort of. This is an 1860 map. Here, the creek is the Quittapahilla. The Quitty, as they call it locally, means pine swamp, and that's a reference to where it begins. It begins in a kind of swamp that's surrounded by a pine forest further to the east. But here's KRIEDER's mill here. There's another mill, Bachman's mill is up here, and then another KRIEDER has a mill right here. So in quick succession, there's three of them, and there's actually about 20 mills at one time along the Quittapahilla. The KRIEDER's mill, the dam was breached in there's a flood in St. Patrick's Day in 1936, and the dam was breached at that time. This is an aerial photo from 1937, and here's the mill here, and you can see the outline of where the pond was up here. It's steeper on this side, but the creek is, after the dam was breached, the creek then cut down a V into the old sediments. Here they are today. This is the sediments. They're about 11 feet deep down where the dam is, what's left of the dam. And of course it grades back about where we're standing here. The dam is actually clear down in here, but where we're standing here, they're about 8 feet deep. If you excavate them, I'm an archaeologist, if you excavate them, there's very tiny layers, and that's a standard mill pond look that you see. The layers are perhaps about 1 millimeter thick, so you have to look closely. But the creek is off over here, much deeper, mill ponds. The next thing is they quit using water power and went to steam power. To get to steam power, you have to heat the water with something. Eventually, at first that was wood, but eventually coal. And so they mined coal extensively in northern Pennsylvania, and western Pennsylvania also. Coal is dusty, and coal dust is flammable, highly flammable. And so you pour water on it to keep it from the dust down, and you take it out of the river and put it back in the river. And so the river begins to fill up with coal dust. Now, this is just north of Harrisburg on the Susquehanna. This is McCormick's Island. I-81 crosses Susquehanna right here. In 1861, or 1851, we looked at it, and we were like, there's way more islands out there. These people were just lazy and didn't bother drawing them in. Well, no, they just weren't any islands there. Here in 1899, you start seeing more islands. See, here's McCormick Island and a little island off to the side. I-81 is crossing here, more islands. And even more in 1993 map. And when we went out to check these islands out, indeed, they're all coal sand. The Susquehanna is choked with coal sand. Now, in the Schuylkill, which reached up into coal country even closer, the coal sand became a much bigger problem. Here, this is a dredge. They're mining the river, they're dredging the coal sand, and they're going to sell it to furnaces, to industrial furnaces to use as a fuel. This is about 6 miles north of Reading, 1946. It became such a problem that in 1950 they built dams. Kernsville Dam is just north of Hamburg, about 20 miles north of Reading. And it's a concrete dam they built in 1950. They let it silt up behind it, and then they would dredge it out. And they did that 3 times. And this is the monument left for the desilting basin. It no longer fills up, so they don't have to do that anymore. And now it's a parking lot for a rails to trails place. Another type of sediment is just alluvial. There's just a lot of erosion going on. And this is in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. Wissahickon Creek here. Rittenhouse Town was an early paper mill. Now, don't go, oh yuck, because the paper mills that we remember smelled badly and used fairly toxic chemicals. But those are only from about 1870 on. That's when they begin to have to grind up trees and break them down. And so that's where the big chemicals came in and the bad smell. Paper mill run in Rittenhouse Town started in 1690, shortly after William Penn arrived. And back then they made paper out of rags. And the water power was used with wooden hammers that just slowly beat up the rags. You know, the rag man draws circles. But people went around collecting rags, and they made paper out of them. You mash up the rags, break down the fibers, and then dry it out in little sheets to make paper. That's how they made paper back then, no chemicals. But this is the earliest paper mill in North America here, and all that. The mill's gone, but the houses where the people lived in are still there. But they asked us to come down and look at the soils here. So we did, and a big column of, this is Paper Mill Run, also called Montgomery Creek. You can see it's not particularly pristine. It's actually in a little channel right here, and where we dug was just right over here in the bank. Well, that map didn't come out so well. But anyhow, here's the, a little bit blurry. Here's the houses here. We dug right in here. Here's where Paper Mill Run flows into Wissahickon Creek. Originally, we thought maybe all this alluvium was the result of a mill pond. And there is a mill downstream here. Our test unit's way up here. But the pond, shown on the historic maps, isn't very big. The mill, they had a picture of the mill. It's a 2-story stone mill, kind of like KREIDER's mill. Our test unit's clear up here. This is the 1877 map, and it shows the pond. The mill's gone by now, but the pond is still here. And so it's pretty far away. When we dug it out, and you can see there's various layers here. Some of them are alluvial, some of them are fill. In other words, some of them people dumped in. I know this doesn't look really good, but I dug it out a second time so that a local archaeologist could look at the layers. So I didn't pay much attention about getting everything straight here. This pavement over here will be important in a moment here. Some garbage up here at the top, and then we came onto a layer that had pull tabs. Soda cans the tab used to come clear off. And they did that between 1963 and 1976. Of course, they got into the environment everywhere. Geese ate them, deer ate them, all with bad results. But they're a marker. And also, I kept finding, at first, the size of my thumbnail, little pieces of styrofoam. But then finally, I found a bigger piece, and it was a Big Mac wrapper. They used to make them out of styrofoam from about 1966 to about 1990. They made them out of styrofoam, so they weren't. So that's what we found in this layer. So we had 2 markers right there, and the biggest flood was Hurricane Agnes in 1972. It may not have been that locally here. That's making a big stretch. You have the right time period, but maybe or maybe not. But Agnes did dump a lot of water, and so there's a lot of erosion. You get this deposition. But then there's that pavement. That pavement looks similar to a lot of WPA pavements that are found in Fairmount Park. So Works Progress Administration, 1938, 1939. And then right below that was another flood layer. So we thought that that was the St. Patrick's Day flood in 1936. Nice time period there. Then there's fill. Then the cinders and coal, you saw a dark layer in that. They dumped cinders and coal in, so we had a fair amount of fill. And then clear down to the water level, there was a whole section of alluvium, and it was the only datable thing in it was from 1865. It was a pipe stem. They used to make pipes out of ceramics, and the pipe stem actually had the manufacturer's imprint on it, and it was made in Scotland between 1866 and 1901. So it fit within the 1889 flood. The 1889 flood was catastrophic across Pennsylvania, but mostly for the people in Johnstown, which it took out. That's a possibility, but like I say, you can get really intense localized floods that don't have anything to do with these large-scale ones, but it also fits in the time period there. We found lots of pottery. We found pottery all through it. This stuff was all alluvial, though. It had washed in from somewhere else. Now, there were fill layers where people would dump stuff, but most of the alluvial stuff had washed in from somewhere else. That is, this all came from the watershed of this creek, which is only about 12 square miles. It's watershed total, so a lot of stuff washed in. These are the legacy sediments.
Okay, that's neat. Interesting stuff. So continuing on this, I'm going to go pretty fast here, showing a lot of slides of these kinds of legacy effects and sediments, etc. I also want to just preface this with, in terms of your note-taking, that you can get the PDF of this from me. I'll put up my email at the end, so you don't have to be, and they're pretty self-explanatory slides, a lot of them, so just bear that in mind, because I'm going to go pretty fast. So we have this forest clearance that Doug's talking about in terms of watershed changes. This is a pretty famous diorama series that's in Harvard. It shows the paintings showing the change from the 1700s in Massachusetts to literally 130 years later, the conversion of the wholesale conversion of the landscape. In Pennsylvania, a lot of this was the really large-scale stuff was later in the 1800s, though a lot of it happened before that. I'm sure Doug could explain. But we had a really massive period of forest clearance and logging going on in the late 1800s to early 1900s. And I want to stress here too, because I'm going to focus on it a little bit, is that in a lot of cases these roads that were in railroad tracks that were put up through these valleys and along the valley sides are the big culprits in terms of sediment yield. I know this from my work in the West. A lot of the even clear-cut logged areas are really not that big in terms of yielding sediment themselves. It's the roads that traverse the hillsides that do it. So that was the case then as well, as it would be probably even much worse, except if depending on the slopes. So you see here, we see the effects of this logging. We see these thin, denuded hillsides that are just now growing back a little bit after clearance. This is in a coal mining area near Connellsville. Again, heading and stave plant, Potter County, basically cleared slopes, denuded, kind of land use that we had. This is a great slide, I think, of clear cut in Potter County that was done in the early 1900s. It was taken in the early 1900s, and basically what you're looking at is, it looks like chaparral or something in California. It's all just regrowing trees, all about the same age, of an area that had been completely denuded, and it must have been at a very rapid pace, and all about the same time. And I think they used to refer to this as the Great Pennsylvania Desert, didn't they? Yeah, so it was all over the Commonwealth. I love this slide. This is in the Poconos. Just got this from the archives. There's the little guy going across the Great Pennsylvania Desert, which had all been old-growth forests not that many years before, presumably. And then we had associated kinds of denudation that happened with different kinds of pollutants from some of these plants that manufacturing operations that were spread around. People didn't care, no regulations, so these are the kind of effects you had. This is actually a picture from the Sierra Nevada that I took off the web, but it's important to stress that grazing was a big component of this erosion that was occurring after these forest clearance and regrowth of forests. It would be common everywhere, for people to continue grazing into these forests when they found that they couldn't really cultivate them too steep, too rocky. They at least send the cows in and get some value out of that, but what they did is pretty much trashed, compacted everything that you see. So this is an older slide from 1917 of the kind of effects you get when you have intensive grazing. In this case, it's in a paddock, but that's what happens. And here we are hauling coal in an already denuded area in terms of logging, but kind of the mix of resource use, extractive resource use that went on. Again, same thing. You see the denuded hill sides in the background. Oil Creek, early oil operation in Pennsylvania. I love this slide. This was taken from the Appalachians back in the 30s. I believe it's down near Shenandoah National Park, where we had that really serious problem of, which is part of the reason they made it a park. They basically had people trying to eke out a living on slopes like this, and you just can't do it. So we have this poor farming practice then that was practiced after everything was cleared, and that is that people tended to, I've never been able to get a good answer, I think Doug's helped me a little bit with why people have to always go up and down the fall line in their plowing. It seems to be a tradition for the most part. I know George Washington and Jefferson both admonished their fellow farmers to go across the slopes, but it didn't have much effect. So we had a lot of erosion as we created these runnels down the fall line of the slopes. We get a lot of erosion from that, as you can see. Just an indication of from an old USDA photo, 1930. This is the kind of land surface change that occurred with field erosion or tillage erosion. Here again, warmer soil surfaces due to grazing in this case within regrown areas in the upper case that we're getting sugar out of. And then here's an orchard, I believe it's in York County somewhere, that shows the kind of erosion that was going on in the 30s and 20s and everything else, all the way up to the 50s. Kind of a classic diagram of sediment yield done by Woolman way back when. I think it needs to be modified now, but it shows you the kind of level, almost nil sediment production from the landscape when it was all in forest. And then with land clearing and grazing, and then we had farmland abandonment, so things started to grow back. Then we had this big suburban episode after World War II when everybody came back and wanted to start living life again, with no controls. And then as that started to dwindle, as things got stabilized, we got into this lower area. But I submit now that we're coming back up, because what we're having now in a lot of the streams throughout developed areas is the streams themselves, the channels, are beginning to widen and erode. Well, not beginning, they've been doing it for decades, but they're the source of most of the sediment in the developed landscape. It's the channels themselves. So, land surface consequences of kind of a native landscape in the Smokies. That's, I believe, a little piece of old growth. A lot of people don't know that much about this, but pit and mountain topography is very characteristic of temperate forests, whether you're in New Zealand or Europe, well, there's hardly anything left in Europe, but wherever you are where there's temperate forests, large trees, you'll get this uneven terrain that develops over decades and hundreds of years as trees topple. That's the way they usually succumb. A lot of times it's even forced by hurricanes and other things, but as they senesce, the trees die, they lose root strength, they topple over, and they create these pits where the roots were. The thing about those pits is they provide a lot of depression storage for rainwater. So you can't basically, when you get right down to it, on a native kind of landscape, a truly pristine forest system, you do not have any runoff from those forests at all. The only place that there's any runoff generated is in the hill slope hollows, where you get saturation excess overland flow. And on the slopes themselves, most of the watershed, 90% plus of it, you're not going to see any overland flow developing because of all these great things like humus layers and stable aggregates and all these great things, including pit and mountain microrelief. But with the erosion, this was largely erased, and in fact, some areas of the state, and this is not paraglacial, some areas of the state have developed a lag or an armor of rocks, of stone that's actually been revealed because so much soil is washed off the surface. And that's basically what you might find in Greece. So it's been that damaging in certain areas. In general, this forest simplification is a great example of the legacy effects in the watersheds of what's been going on. This is an old photo from the 30s in North Carolina. I've driven by many places where you still have forest grazing in Pennsylvania, but it's been dicey in terms of getting in there and photographing it. I didn't want to get chased off from the farmer or whatever. It's still going on. So we have a lot of landscapes throughout this area that have these old field boundaries that were marked when they cleared this and maybe farmed it and grazed it. But these slopes are now much smoother than they ever were before. They're not at all, in terms of hydrology, resembling or biology, resembling what was there before. It's important to emphasize that. In a lot of places, this is very close to where I live actually, in the greater Harrisburg area, you can see these healed gullies coming down the steeper slopes off the bluffs that were farmed, and then they just let the runoff reach the creeks this way. But that's stopped now. Those are all residences up at the top, and then you've got these healed gullies. If you look, you'll see them everywhere. And also, the other thing to emphasize here is, particularly in these situations along waterside slopes, that a lot of times it is so eroded from the past that this is great. Granted, it will show up in a GIS map as forest, but it's not necessarily doing the hydrologic work that we want it to do. In other words, it's still acting like almost a pavement. Tillage erosion is indicated by these old photos. This is from 1940 in Lancaster County. You can see all the gullies. You can see these white marks, which indicate where the soil is, the organic rich surface soil is washed off in the past through erosion. You can still see it today. This is actually from Iowa. But you can see the lighter colored, that's where the topsoil has been eroded, topsoil accumulation in the darker areas. The other thing you can see, and you see it all over here again, but you don't necessarily, it's subtle, is this boundary change, where you're down a slope that was formerly presumably farmed differently, and you get an abrupt change in the hill slope that reflects different methods of tillage or grazing or whatever, so different variable erosion rates. Those are signs of that kind of legacy effect. Farmland hydrology, just so you understand that that's not at all like forests. It's totally different. They also drain very quickly, more like an urban kind of watershed hydrograph. And this is being the forest, more delayed, more peaks. So they are not, in terms of hydrology, not healthy landscapes. Watercourse alterations. Well, the big thing that people started doing, well, I'll get back to that. But this is, I think, an important thing to just keep in your mind when you're doing any kind of conservation work. This is just a picture from California because it's clear, because there's a little vegetation here, kind of a long, elongated, heart-shaped watershed. Most of the watershed, 99% in most cases, is all hill slopes, okay? It's not creeks. The creeks are just the receivers of all that, the transporters of the sediment and whatever else is coming off the watershed. We talk about restoring creeks. Well, how do you restore something where this has all been massively altered, truly restored? Well, you really don't. You rehabilitate to the extent that you're capable, but you have obviously greatly changed the whole runoff situation within the system. And it's important to keep that in mind when we talk about creeks and restoring them. Doug talked about the dams. There was a rapid sedimentation in all these old mill dams. Here again, a USDA source, 1941, an open water feature, 1911. 1941, it's all silted in. So 30 years later, it's gone. It's disappeared. These are all over the place. This is the kind of situation that Doug was talking about too. The alluviation in the streams of all this stuff coming off the watersheds. So modern sediments or legacy sediments, here's the original pre-European settlement situation. I've drawn multiple channels just because that might have been the case in places. But we have this accumulation, this wedge of finer alluvium that drains off the hill slopes as they're eroding, and that creates these very deep in size channels that are very erodible because this material is generally non-cohesive, mostly silts. Shot that it was actually in the Science magazine article, I think it was, about legacy sediments forming behind mill dams. Again, Doug also emphasized it. You don't have to have a mill dam to have a legacy sediment. They're everywhere. They've been near all the valleys, lower gradient valleys in Europe, United States, where it's been settled for a while, everywhere. So they're ubiquitous. Here's a alluvial valley that never was dammed. You can see the big piece of sawn timber in there. It's like the Coke can with the, it gives you a time frame. And so that's just an example. The stream channelization was a massive part of what we've done to change things. We straightened up streams along, to make them better drain, and typically along field boundaries, sometimes called straightening up a field. Streams were typically pushed all the way over to the hillside, straightened to conform to the hillside edge, all causing a lot of incision and erosion. When we started to suburbanize and develop this landscape, this legacy landscape, we did it on already impacted streams. In other words, streams that were already altered vastly by this change in regime from the forest to agriculture. And these have become these sort of abused and difficult to heal backyard streams that we're now dealing with. They're much more confined. Like these, just in a couple of different areas. Everywhere we see this, these are all legacy, basically, of this past sequence of land use. And then, of course, we've pushed everything over, confined everything, and have ongoing adjustments happening all the time. The stream even trying to re-meander itself, of course, within this, but it's straitjacketed. And then our hard armoring everywhere throughout the state. It's just ubiquitous. Biological legacies. I'd love to stay with this longer, but there's too much to talk about. Stilt grass growing in woods in the shade. Used to be weeds just kind of grew in the sun. Too bad. Chestnut, we've lost that, a foundation species. The ecosystems were based on it. We talk about fisheries, and we particularly like brown and rainbow trout, but they're aliens. It's important to remember. We've lost all the top predators in terms of their functionality, at least. There might be a few cats around, but they're not doing the deer control that we should have. Deer density, but that happens with the fencing off that we talked about in the previous session. Again, the weeds, or most invasive plants, are typically highly tolerant of different conditions. And now what we have is what ecologists are starting to call novel ecosystems, i.e. the ecosystems we have now are not anything resembling what we had before. They never will be again. We have new components to the ecosystems, all these invasives. We have lost major species, so we've got a whole new mix of stuff. And we come up with what are called now novel ecosystems. And I believe that is more or less the future. This is actually in Wissahickon Park. It might have been changed by now, but there was a lot of invasive alien species in there. I know there was a lot of Norway maple, I think, and maybe ailanthus. But the idea is that these ecosystems, though they might look intact, are in fact utterly changed from what they were previously. And I don't even have the time to go into the soil changes that have occurred. Removing weeds, great and good, but I don't know how that we're going to maintain this over the longer time frame, particularly since some people are starting to be concerned about repeated herbicide applications and what that means for the soil fauna, mycorrhiza, and all that stuff in the soil, that we need to have a healthy soil. So we can't just keep applying biocides until time runs out, because I don't know when that will be. We don't know when the asteroid's coming. So we have the global I love this picture. The global transportation system all mapped out for us. And here we are, right in the thick of things. So you can see the challenges out there for any kind of restorative conservation activities. We're getting this homogenization of ecosystems. As we get weeds come in, other species extirpated. The special legacy of transportation, in particular roads now. Railroads are not as big as they used to be, but in terms of sediment yield, hydrologic interruption, habitat fragmentation, etc. I love this picture, though it's maybe a little hard to interpret. Basically what it says is, up to the blue, it's about 1,500 feet, half a kilometer, of distance to the nearest road. You can see from Pennsylvania, for example, there's hardly anywhere that's more than 1,500 feet from the nearest road. So they're embedded in there, but they're not available at that scale. So you can see that roading has basically just completely covered the country, changed everything dramatically, as was talked about in the previous talk in terms of habitat fragmentation. A landscape ecologist named Richard Foreman came up with this road effect zone, I think he did, notion. That is that these edge effects extend way into the forest. So it's not just the road, the travel way, or even the cut and fill slopes adjacent. The effects of the road in terms of fragmenting habitat and getting rid of interior areas is huge and extends everywhere. This is a fairly remarkable USGS photo of Pennsylvania showing the exploration roads and paths for shale oil, gas, excuse me. And as you can see in a slide like this, there's essentially no place that's intact from a habitat standpoint if you count in the road effect zone. Fragmentation, even edges that far back, or from the edge, excuse me, are not interior habitat. This is kind of gruesome, I know, but I think it's important to point out that one of the things these roads do, they literally are responsible for a huge amount of wildlife death. This was from a study at Purdue, and like 90% of the species were amphibians that were killed in their migrations for reproduction. Again, roads are major sediment sources, and we have them everywhere, leaking into the streams, eroding channels everywhere, created with roads, in addition to channelizing things. That's how we've done it, by severing the slopes, cutting into them, not accommodating the fact that they're going to still drain, subsurface flow is still going to drain, create saturated faces, and then the landscape is going to attempt to adjust by landsliding. And we've extended the drainage network like many times over what it was before. So when there was originally a natural drainage network like this in the blue, we've supplemented that now with all the ditches along the roadways so that it's doubled at least. So here's our legacy landscape. What we have now, a common scene you might see out in the countryside. This is in Pennsylvania. I just added all the notes to it. Got a novel forest, eroded ground, alien species, the new keystone species in this case, cows, alien forbs, alien grasses that they're eating, and a completely simplified and changed stream system. So that's the reality that we're dealing with, and I hope that people will become totally cognizant of that and recognize the challenges, because if you don't, it's just going to lead to sorrow. We are now in what people are starting to call the Anthropocene. It's even going to be probably in the next 5 years be adopted by the geological committee that does such things. We have in our sediments now all kinds of indications of past change. Coke cans, sawn timbers, all kinds of stuff. So we now have the sedimentary record that proves that we've been modifying things as if we didn't already know. So that's called the Anthropocene. It's basically since the start of the Industrial Revolution. We're in it. It's a human-dominated world now. No going back. Here's the kind of things that we are dealing with. These are just a short list. Everything is on an exponential curve in terms of area cultivation, floods, total earth moved, you name it. And this is world population growth. They screwed that up, but other than that, I think you know what's going on here. When I was born in 1950, there was about 2.5 billion people. And there's, what, 7.5 billion now? And that's not easy to kind of live your whole life being involved in resources and realize that, what you're up against. So that's the big driver. Also, in terms of climate change, if you believe that humans are part of one of the forcing factors, in other words, we've added enough additional, other than natural sources, enough additional greenhouse gases, and in fact, if that's the actual causative effect, then climate change becomes a legacy effect. If you don't believe that, that's fine. It's still up for question. But what we can't not believe, and what we can't stand listening to anymore, is I don't believe in climate change. Climates always change, go up and down, so don't let anybody ever say that to you again. It's got to stop. It's like gravity. It's changing. It may go down in 10 years, it may go up. Chances are it's going to go up, but who knows? All bets are off, but it's going to change. And it's been changing for actually a long time. When we talk about native species, even in urban areas, this heat island effect has been noted in terms of what grows well and what doesn't in urban areas versus the countryside. So we might be having to really modify our notions of what the best plantings mix is, native or otherwise, in an heavily urbanized area. We're becoming a more urban world versus what we can grow out in the countryside, just from the climate standpoint. Changes in ecosystems, projected. Notice Pennsylvania, the different communities that are changing. And I think another point to get across is one of the things that has been noted, again, in the instrument record, not a matter of debate, is the fact that we get more intense situations now, whether it be droughts, intense rainstorms, etc. And that really stresses the ecosystems. It stresses what we try to do to repair them in terms of bank protection or growing plants or whatever. So we have a new conservation that we have to start thinking about in this uncertain future in terms of more and more people living on it. Some people have, one guy in particular, but I've seen it referenced now a few times, so it's a nice term. This notion of reconciliation ecology, where we try to manage the land in a way that is both compatible with our needs and as much biodiversity as we can achieve. We have to change our paradigms in terms of how we manage our land and what we think is right and looks right and feels right, because these are really biological wastelands. But they can be brought back to life. At the regional level, we can do all kinds of things like try to preserve as much of this high-quality watersheds like up in Potters County or whatever that's regrown. Keep it as intact as possible. We're going to have to find the will and the way to do it. We have to provide connectivity in these what are now very fragmented landscapes. That includes watercourse buffers, it includes hedgerows. So in much of Europe, and in fact in Great Britain's been very big on this for decades, and in the restoration ecology field, there's always been a little bit of a dichotomy from the European side of the Atlantic versus and particularly in the western United States, as to what constitutes restoration. Since their landscapes look like this for the last 1,500, 2,000 years. And they've learned that a lot of species can survive in that kind of landscape if you provide the travel corridors. And I think we're going there. So we need buffers. They need to make sense. This is a great shot. I think it was from the Center County Conservation District off the web. Just shows this. Can't you just see some guy in with a musket or something wandering out there to get a pig? I mean, it basically looks. I'm sure much of the stream courses looked like that a century ago. If you let it grow back, a lot of benefits accrue. And I think one thing that's really important from a conservation standpoint in this changing world is that we not get stuck in too many narrow paradigms in terms of what's appropriate. I've been looking at the buffer literature for more than 20 years and dealing with it in terms of planning and especially on the West Coast. And it's very much a volatile thing because it quote unquote takes land, presumably. And we come up with these huge recommendations that are really not based on much and that they're all very site sensitive. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that what constitutes a healthy buffer is going to change by landscape setting. For example, it talks here about bank stabilization, 50 feet. Well, all you need is about 10 or 15 feet of a bank that's fully vegetated and laid back and stable. And it's bank protection. It's not 50. So that's all good to have this, but it also takes up more of the landscape that would otherwise people would want. Hedgerows and farm landscapes. Again, here's Lancaster County, not much in the way of hedgerows. Here's England, a long tradition, though they're losing it. Too bad. Farmed hedgerows provide food and wildlife habitat. Plant insectaries along here. The honeybee, for example, you all know about that, and it's the issues. We need to keep honeybees, I think, most of us agree, but we also need to encourage native bees, and you can do that with the plantings. It's an invasive, not invasive particularly, but I suppose, but certainly the honeybee is an alien species. So this notion of creating insectaries in all these field boundaries and everywhere you can, is part of natural landscaping. Another conservation activity I think is well worth it is to essentially eliminate all the barriers to migration that you can in streams, whether it be dam removal or taking out culverts, doing stuff like that with what had been a culvert, so it's passable to a variety of critters. Dam removal is all great, but we don't just want to let the sediment go downstream like people have been doing in many cases. We need to actually recreate a channel and remove the sediment, all very expensive, so it has to be warranted based on the fishery. And I just wish we could finally start fencing the cows out of the stream. I mean, how long do we have to go on with this? It's crazy. Because when you do, I really couldn't find any pictures on the web, and I haven't actually taken any of my own. This is a Western photo. When you do, you get this recovery that's really quite remarkable. And if the stream hasn't incised too badly, it'll become very, very stable in a very short amount of time. Reaccrete sediments, etc. So all we have to do is spend some money on fencing, and we're going to get a lot of benefit. Preserve prime farmland. I don't know how you do it, but we're going to have to grow food here. If you think the Ogallala aquifer isn't drying up, you need to look into it a little more. That's where a lot of your food's coming from. So we don't want to have to migrate up into the hillsides here on Blue Ridge and other places with a bunch of terraces in order to feed ourselves. This is an example of sprawl and the kind of statistics that you see. Acreage, thousands of acres per day. 2002, 350,000 acres. It's hard to believe, but we know it's huge. And a big issue is this exurbanization, this basically rural sprawl, they call it now, in terms of spreading out into the countryside, having a lot of lawn, that sort of thing. In terms of habitat, that's extremely damaging. We need to promote infill. This is in the Susquehanna Township, Lower Paxton Township area near Harrisburg, near where I live. You can see these big areas that have yet to be filled in. We fill those areas in and we reduce sprawl. Blighted areas need to be redeveloped. I know a lot of people, it's not the paradigm, but we need to start living closer together if we're going to preserve any countryside, whether it's to grow crops or just enjoy. Cluster, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. That's been a big thing here and pioneered here really. But if you think about it, same number of houses, a much better landscape obviously from a habitat standpoint versus conventional, but this footprint still was a farm or a forest. So we're still taking up land. So that's why I'm a big promoter of this infill and more tight development from a conservation standpoint. Require soil and nutrient conservation through no-till, for example, or other methods. Rehabilitate streams. Interesting, there was just an article in the Patriot News in Harrisburg in December about Amish country on Lancaster County and some of the stream work. So I took his photo and used it. Just regrading the banks, planting them, getting the cows out. It's going to do a huge amount. Get people off the floodplains when we can, buy it back. I have interesting anecdotes about that in terms of people telling me, but we've just had our 100-year flood. We're cool. And it's got to stop. They need a short course in statistics or something, but I've been down that road in public meetings and out in the field when I'm looking at people's houses tumbled topsy-turvy, and they say, well, I think we'll rebuild. All righty. So wherever we can, we need to restore floodplains, though that can be very difficult. But if you, for example, as people move more into the cities, a lot of these areas are going to get vacated. We can maybe start slowly restoring some floodplain areas. We will then get the downstream benefits in terms of flood relief. Road reclamation, one of my big pet peeves. It hurts my eyes to look at road cuts that are trashed and eroding and it's just no good. The only place you really see nice roadsides, it seems, is in the national parks. This is where we live, man. So we got to stabilize all the gravel roads. This is actually in Shenandoah Park. They did a lot of early soil bioengineering work in that park with the CCC guys and created these verdant roadsides that you see now. I'll be done here in a minute. Road decommissioning and basically removal, where do you think that's going to happen? How about where are all those gas wells when they dry up? And then we need to do more and more around where we live. Make green landscaping, rain gardens, tons of retrofit opportunities. Just planting some trees in this 15-year-old development would help. And then Douglas Tallamy's insight that we need the native plants to the extent that we can get them to feed the baby birds because the native plants support the caterpillars that the baby birds. If you all have babies, you know that they like soft food, not crickets. So it's a wonderful thing, I think. Good, best impetus possible. Water-sensitive design, low-impact development, which I hate that term, but that's what we use now. It's all good and it dovetails very nicely with habitat recreation. If I don't offend anybody, and even if I do, you got to get rid of your damn grass. It's basically a desert. But you got to change your paradigm of thinking about things, I guess, if you're going to do it. Livability, and this is one of my projects out in the west that I was able to work on. And this was flood damaged, and it's a major draw for people in this small community. All the little cafes are lined along the creek. So, impediments, real quickly. Sensibilities. I think depending on your population, it's going to vary regionally. In certain places, there are sensibilities of at least a large enough percentage of people that are aligned with biodiversity conservation. In other areas, it's not, and that's a huge problem. And I guess education about why this is important. It's a big part of solving that problem, if it's solvable. I've used the term for decades now, Disney-esque, for landscapes that are sterile. And it's the modern paradigm. It has been for a long time. The grass, everything clean, everything neat. Unfortunately, nature doesn't like that stuff. And so we've really hurt ourselves in the long run. We've got to somehow get more to the naturalistic view of things. And to the extent we're able to incorporate natives, encourage those animals and plants, I, for one, and I think a lot of us would prefer that kind of environment in the long run, hearing birds tweet rather than having the true lawn people come out every spring, and which they do across my street from me, and I sit there and rail at them. Resistance to change, we know everything's changing. The old ecological paradigms of climax, all that's gone now. It's been gone for 20 years. Read Botkin. Lack of mandatory regulations. We don't do what we say we want to do. We just don't do it because we won't regulate. So we've got ongoing sprawl, and of course we've got cost. And biophilia. This is, I'm having a brain cloud. Wilson's thing. Is that we have this affinity, and all you have it, towards the natural world. It hasn't been very much encouraged, really, or promoted, but that's our only salvation, really, is we have to encourage that. That's the biggest conservation challenge, I guess, is to make sure that gets inculcated in everyone. So there's you can get me at that, oh, it's way at the bottom, I don't know if you can even see it, but it's tmoses@skellyloy.com. And I'll send you a PDF of this if you want it. I didn't want to have handouts and waste a bunch of paper. Now, questions, notions?
I had a question about what you're saying about pristine streams, the difference between a pristine stream versus what we call healthy.
Mm-hmm.
You said that large woody debris qualifies it as a pristine stream.
It's really abundant and it really
Right.
dominates the stream.
And I was wondering if there's any other, I guess, qualifiers for pristine streams versus healthy
course.
streams that the average person
Sure.
might not know about.
Well, you know, if they've got the population of the pollution intolerant, bugs basically in them, and if they support a fishery, let's say we're talking cold water stream, that's what people usually think of. Not necessarily true, of course, but if they've got all those other characteristics, but what I'm getting at is if they still lack the large woody debris, they're not pristine, because a truly pristine stream, even though it's healthy otherwise, doesn't have that vital component. And that whole cold water fauna, whether it be salmon and trout on the west, or trout and other species in the mountains here, particularly brook trout, they co-evolved with the wood. And if it's not there, they're missing a lot of bugs that like the wood. They're missing a lot of things. And they're missing an incredible amount of habitat diversity. If you've ever, and I've built engineered log jams out west, and if you ever build one of those, you build it and they will come. Because if you have a snorkel survey, 2 years later, all the fish are there, especially the babies. So that's gone. And it's going to take a long time. You've got to get old growth forest basically to get it back. Any other questions? Yes.
I remember reading a few years ago, but I don't remember the details, about the possibility of trying to reintroduce the American chestnut to the American landscape in the eastern part of the United States.
I'm not that knowledgeable, but I believe I've been to conferences where the Chestnut Association or whatever has had their efforts, their ongoing efforts to try to establish a viable chestnut.
Didn't they find like a stand of the?
Yeah, I think they've got some secret places.
In Georgia somewhere.
Yeah,
They're gonna try to.
That's what I read.
Yeah. Okay.
There's a place where they don't tell you, but there's
Right.
a place where there's a resistant stand, I think. The other thing that I didn't mention, things like elms. I mean, elms, there's good elms again. We have elm, we should be planting elm trees again on Elm Street for shade. They grow fast, they're great trees. Things like that. There's all kinds of stuff. That's good, that's real positive stuff. Any other ideas or contrary notions about what I said? You don't believe it? It's all going to be pristine again, and we're going to, what do you think, Doug?
The prevailing in archaeology, the prevailing belief is come around that the oak chestnut forest, when Europeans arrived here, is actually an artificial forest that the Native Americans created simply by cutting down everything else. Because you can't make it, no model will create oak chestnut forest where you have 85% of the species, just these two species. It appears to have started in the late Archaic about 5,000 to 4,000 years ago. So, in late Archaic, you see lots of artifacts up in the uplands. And so they're up there, and I guess they were cutting down stuff, yeah.
Yeah, well, on that same field, real quickly, I have a particular affinity to been down to Guatemala and southern Mexico and Honduras and those kind of places earlier in my life, and was particularly into the Mayans, and named my oldest daughter Maya. And you go to those sites, and there's a particular suite of plants that are growing there that don't grow out in the forest. They selected for certain things, and they're still growing there and reproducing. So those particular trees that were productive of certain kinds of fruits and things that they favored. So we've been modifying things since day one. Yeah, you had a question.
I was just wondering, in terms of your comment on the oak chestnut forest having been perhaps an artifact, what are the current numbers on the population densities, pre-Columbian population densities in this part of the world? Because that's gone up very substantially over the last
few years. But the population density of Native Americans outside of the big river valleys was never very high. But you see two spikes. There's a spike in the late Archaic, and then there's not a lot of artifacts, and then the late woodland. Now the late woodland, we know maize, beans, and squash were adapted for northern climates, and you see an explosion of the population at that time. But the late Archaic, it's not really clear why you get a population explosion there. And was it as much as the late woodland? Probably not. But yes, you know, the population estimates are clearly higher. You see villages of 2,000, 3,000 people, and they were sustained over a long period of time by just literally square miles of gardens, because their gardening wasn't as intensive as the European. They kind of lacked the technology to pile up stuff. But nonetheless, you have to feed yourself over the winter, so you got to have all that stuff out there. But the population density, yes, the estimates are higher, but some of the upper ends I'm not so sure about, just because you just don't see that many artifacts out there once you get outside the river valleys. The river valleys are heavily populated, but they're also limited.
Hey, can I say something really quick? That was a perfect, I think, segue to this notion of gardening. The business of ecological restoration, and I've been involved in it, and particularly with some serious plant Nazis out in Oregon, where I used to live. Totally into the natives, and I am too. I mean, it's a good thing, but this has always been a bone of contention. A lot of people have thought of basically ecological restoration as basically gardening on a larger scale and for different purposes. And I'm not sure that's such a bad way to look at it. If you're a diligent gardener and you accept that the world's changed, maybe we can do a lot of good that way. You had a question? I don't know.
What sources would you recommend for reading more about the concept of reconciliation ecology?
I can send you, if you send me an email, I can send you the papers.
Okay, thanks.
You made a point about regional, how everything needs to be regional.
Well,
With how the United States is set up in municipalities, and half the time they don't get along.
that's right.
You know, you have Kutztown and Maxitawny, who's surrounded by Maxitawny, and they hate each other.
Slides.
How are we gonna?
Slides I had prepared at great length, some slides on institutional constraints, administrative constraints. This state is fraught with administrative units. It's one of the biggest, it's costing us a fortune, and it's getting in the way of good conservation. And you know, you compare it to some of the western states where the counties are way bigger, and that's all you have is counties and cities. We have all these different units, and they boil down to something like 8 square miles to a side on average. If you multiplied them all and divided into the area of the state, it's craziness. Yeah, if we can amalgamate those institutions, we all not only save a bunch of bucks, but we could do a lot more conservation-wise, and we could have, like people, you know, maybe combining and joining forces. And, yeah, just as an interest, I think this is still true. I learned this, 25 years ago. The only country in the world that divides itself up by natural regions, by watersheds, in terms of administrative units, is New Zealand. And I think that's still the case. I don't know why, but they did it that way, and that's what everybody should do, but it's a legacy effect that we are unlikely to get to that soon, I guess. So anything else? Thanks. Thank you.